Hi, Minister. Good to see you. Thank you very much for making the time.
My pleasure, Vashi.
Can you explain to Canadians watching, Minister, why it was okay to pause the price on carbon for home heating oil, but not for this upcoming increase as of April 1st?
So the very reason for putting a price on pollution, and it's been done before, and not just for climate change, but for other environmental challenges, is that you want to incentivize change in behavior for companies, industrial organizations, but also individuals. What we found out with home heating oil is that the vast majority, in fact, of people who are still using home heating oil in Canada, and there are more people in my home province of Quebec than in all of Atlantic Canada, for example, that still use it, but tend to be lower to middle income Canadians who don't have the money to make the switch for less polluting form of home heating oil, home heating, which is why we decided to put a pause specifically on this, because home heating oil is the most expensive, it's the most inefficient, and it's the most polluting way of heating your home.
And I do take your point, Minister, that as far as volume goes, there are more of those homes outside of Atlantic Canada, but as a portion of the types of heating that's used, it's far greater in Atlantic Canada than it is in other parts of the country. And the Atlantic MP surrounding the Prime Minister, when he made that announcement, I think speaks to that fact. But at this point in time, given the affordability struggles, like you highlight many of those using home heating oil are facing, would it not be worth considering pressing pause in this instance?
No, it wouldn't, because we can't put a pause on climate change. And what Pierre Poilievre never talks about is the fact that people right now, 8 out of 10 Canadians, families, get more money back than they pay in carbon pricing. So the richest among us don't, the people who pollute the most, but 8 out of 10 Canadian families, and that has been confirmed by the Parliamentary Budget Officer. So if we were to do that, we would actually hurt people economically while they're struggling. It wouldn't help them at all.
So let's just unpack that statement for a moment, because when the Parliamentary Budget Officer considered the in and out, exactly what you're referring to, he did determine that when you take just the direct input of the carbon tax and the value of the rebate, more Canadians are better off. But when you add on the economic impact, so for example, the impact on investment income and overall on economic growth, slightly more Canadians, he determined, were worse off. Add to that, Minister, the fact that you have about $2.5 billion, only $100 million of which has been allocated that was supposed to be set aside for those who are disproportionately impacted by the carbon price, so farmers, small business owners, and Indigenous people, and you have yet all these years in to disperse that money. Is it fair to truly say more Canadians are better off?
Absolutely, it is. The Parliamentary Budget Officer, and he did some interviews this week, is the first one to recognize that this analysis is a partial analysis. It doesn't take into account the economic benefits of growing renewable and clean tech industry and the investments that we're doing in electrification of transportation, which will have very beneficial economic impacts to Canadians. It will come over time in the coming years. The Parliamentary Budget Officer is the first one to recognize that his analysis doesn't take into consideration the cost to Canadians of climate change. And in terms of farmers, we've returned more than $1 billion of federal investment to help farmers reduce their carbon footprint, to reduce their pollution in the last 2 years. There is a portion of the money that we still have to return for small and medium-sized businesses and to Indigenous communities, and we're working to do that, and this will happen in the coming months.
But with respect, Minister, that money has been set aside since 2019. Those small businesses are telling your government and us frequently how difficult things are for them at the moment. It's not nothing. It's 10% of what you've taken in through the carbon tax, and so far you've dispersed just $100 million of that.
So a couple of things. I mean, we lowered taxes for small and medium-sized businesses. So we have been there for them. We supported them through the pandemic, through billions of dollars of federal support. 80% of the money that was spent during the pandemic to help Canadians, to help businesses, and especially small and medium-sized businesses, came from the federal government. In terms of the carbon carbon pricing. We are in the process of returning that money. We haven't been sitting on $2 billion since 2019. The program was put in place in 2019. This money has accumulated over time, and we will be returning it to them as we promised to do, as I said, in the coming months.
And then I just wanted to look ahead, if you could, for a moment, Minister, to what the future looks like, because you know that this will form a big part of the political debate going forward and heading into the next election. Right now, the plan that your government laid out post-2019, the 2019 election, got us to 2030 and the targets that you set out to 2030, and that is when the price on carbon will reach $170 a ton. Do you intend for that price to continue to go up, since you do see this as such an integral part of your climate policy beyond 2030 to help Canada reach its 2050 target?
So we haven't made a decision on that. We've started consultation to prepare the next phase of emission reduction, so post-2030 in Canada, in fact, going to 2035. Those consultations are ongoing. Canada will need to make a determination by next year, as per our United Nations commitment, to set those new targets for 2035. We will need to do that by next year, by 2025. There's no decision that has been made yet, other than we will continue increasing the price on pollution. But also, for people who are watching it, we will continue increasing the rebate so that 8 of 10 Canadians can continue receiving more than what they pay. But no decision has been made as to what would happen after 2030.
You have a lot of experience in this field, and I'm wondering, from where you sit at this point, if you think, given the arguments your government has put forth, that the consumer side of the price on carbon, which the Climate Institute this week said was accounting for 8 to 9% of reductions in emissions by 2030, or projected to by 2030, if you believe it to be a key ingredient beyond 2030?
As you pointed out, Vashi, I've been doing this for some time. I've been looking at climate change measures, policies, programs for the better part of my adult life, really, the last 30 years. And if there's a measure somewhere that someone can point to me that will help us to achieve at least 10%, if we're talking about the fuel charge, of our 2030 targets at no extra cost to consumers. It's revenue neutral. Whatever we collect, we send back. If there's a measure like that lying around under a rock somewhere, someone needs to show it to me, because I haven't seen it.
Is that certainly the case, though, especially when you take into account what the Climate Institute pointed out this week, that the industrial side of the carbon price is 3 times as effective? Could you not strengthen measures on that side? And just to sort of add to that, I know that you're talking about Pierre Poilievre, but he isn't the only, and I understand your criticisms there, but he isn't the only politician saying a consumer price on carbon isn't necessary. Many of your progressive allies, like Premier Wab Kinew, like the leader of the Alberta NDP, Rachel Notley, like Liberal Bonnie Crombie, like Liberal Andrew Furey, all of them are saying the same thing as Pierre Poilievre in this instance.
Fighting climate change is hard. And the easy thing to do would be to cave in and say, okay, we won't do that. But if we don't continue putting in place measures to fight climate change, then it means more Canadians being impacted by heat waves. But I mean, how many tens of thousands of Canadians had to be evacuated across the country last year? Sometimes once, twice, 3 times, because of the forest fires. Nova Scotia, worst forest fires in the history of the country, worst droughts in the history of the country, worst tropical storm in the history of the country. And those provincial politicians who say we shouldn't be doing that haven't come up with any measures to say how we will fight climate change. They have no plan that shows how we get to meet our 2030 targets and contribute to the international efforts. Of course, Canada won't solve climate change on its own, but no one can do.
So Premier Furey has no plan. That's your contention? Because he would contend otherwise.
He doesn't have a plan that shows how we get to 2030. And if someone comes to tell me you shouldn't be doing this measure, then they have the responsibility to tell me and Canadians how we get there. Because otherwise it's just caving into political pressure. And yes, it's tough politically. But it's not because it's tough that we shouldn't be doing it. In fact, quite the opposite. We have a moral responsibility to Canadians, to our kids and grandkids, to ensure that we do everything we can to fight climate change, and doing it at a cost that is reasonable. And pricing is one of the most efficient way of doing that. Doing it otherwise would mean more taxpayers' dollars on the hook for that.
Minister, I'll leave it on that note. I appreciate your time very much today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vashi.